there are 6 huge mistakes that will kill your fantasy novel on page 1. I know this because I've edited 34 fantasy novels for writers over the past year and a half, and I've also had hundreds of other writers send in their opening pages when they have applied to work with me, and I see this same 6 mistakes come up again and again. I've also personally published 12 fantasy novels, and over the 12 plus years that I've been writing, I've had to learn about many of these mistakes the hard way, starting with mistake number 1, writing a clickbait first sentence. So you obviously want to write a first sentence that intrigues your reader. You already know this, but please, for the love of God, do not write a clickbait sentence. In the context of writing, a clickbait sentence occurs when you just try to introduce the story with something that feels shocking and cool and unexpected because you've heard how important it is to write a great first sentence. But then your following sentences or maybe the rest of your story doesn't really deliver on that opening sentence. And so the reader will just realize that you said this thing simply to hook them and to get their attention rather than to lead them into your story in the best way possible. And that's going to make your reader feel cheated and annoyed. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about here, coming from 6 of Crows by Leigh Bardugo. Now, I love this book. It's a really great book as a whole, but I think it has a clickbaity first sentence, which frankly annoys me quite a bit. Here's how the story opens. Juiced had 2 problems, the moon and his moustache. He was supposed to be making his rounds at the Hode house, but for the last 15 minutes he'd been hovering around the southeast wall of the gardens, trying to think of something clever and romantic to say to Anya. What's the issue here? Well, the moustache explanation doesn't really come until 200 words later into this first page, and it kind of feels like a nothing burger. It's basically just he's a teenager, he can't quite grow a moustache, which is a struggle. I also struggle from myself. And as a result, he feels like he's not going to be able to impress this girl that he loves in the story. But it's not really a major issue. And likewise, the problem with the moon isn't really anything either. It's just that the weather in this city is really bad and you can't see the moon. And therefore, his planned pickup line of how he's going to compare Anya's skin to the moonlight won't really work. And it just feels annoyingly convoluted and like the author had this idea for a gripping first sentence in their mind, but then it just sort of falls flat on the page for me. And I think part of this as well comes down to the fact that Juiced is a throwaway character who we never see again after chapter 1. Like I said, I really enjoy 6 of Crows, and in particular the sequel to this book I find fantastic as well, but I don't think it's the strongest opening in my opinion. You can usually tell when you've written a clickbaity first sentence when you feel the pressure to do a lot of backtracking and justification to explain why this opening sentence works or makes sense in your story. And that's a really big problem because you'd probably be better off just moving swiftly into the flow of your story and establishing instant momentum and movement for your reader. So when it comes to hooking your reader on page 1 of your fantasy novel, I find it's much more useful to think about how your opening paragraphs work together to create intrigue, rather than just focusing so myopically on your first sentence. And heck, sometimes you don't even need to write a particularly interesting or clever first sentence. Just get us into an interesting scene and move with the story from there. Now, in credit to 6 of Crows, chapter 2 has a much stronger opening, and personally, this is actually where I would have suggested beginning the story in the first place. Let me read it to you, and as we go through this, notice how much more powerful this particular opening combination of sentences is. Kazbrecker didn't need a reason. Those were the words whispered on the streets of Ketterdam, in the taverns and coffee houses, in the dark and bleeding alleys of the pleasure district known as the Barrel. The boy they called Dirty Hands didn't need a reason, any more than he needed permission, to break a leg, sever an alliance, or change a man's fortunes with the turn of a card. Of course they were wrong, Inedge considered as she crossed the bridge over the black waters of the Birch Canal to the deserted main square that fronted the exchange. Every act of violence was deliberate, and every favour came with enough strings attached to stage a puppet show. Kaz always had his reasons. Inedge could just never be sure they were good ones, especially tonight. This opening sentence doesn't feel like clickbait because it plays directly into Inedge wondering about the morality of her boss. It builds Kaz up to be quite an interesting character with a good sense of layers to him, and it leaves us wondering what the characters are about to do right now. It's not some shocking statement given to us out of context. It feeds smoothly into the momentum and purpose of the scene. And again, this is why I think it would have been stronger to start the book right here. So let's discuss the second opening page mistake I see new fantasy writers make all the time, and it is having a low rate of revelation. If you are using the industry standard manuscript format to send in your book to a potential publisher, you're going to get around 750 characters on your opening page, or roughly 130 words, again, depending on how long those individual words might be. Now, once your novel is actually printed for readers, you're going to get anywhere between, let's say, 150 to 300 words words on your first page. Again, this depends a lot on how your book is formatted. But the point being is that in these opening few hundred words, I would argue that it is critical to have a high rate of revelation. The rate of revelation is, put simply, how fast new information is being revealed and exposed to your reader. Let me give you an example of a paragraph with a slow rate of revelation. And in the case of this paragraph, the slow rate of revelation makes it quite bad. Luca narrowed his eyes as he watched the mansion from atop a nearby roof. Golden light spilled out through the mansion's windows, staining the street below. The mansion itself was an imposing structure, with its silhouette cutting a stark figure against the inky blackness of the night sky. The air was cool and still. That was a welcome relief from the heat of the day. Gargoyles perched atop the gabled roof of the mansion, looking menacing in the darkness. Luca ran his gaze across the windows, studying them intently. This paragraph feels so insanely boring and slow because we have 7 sentences and pretty much every single sentence tells us that it's nighttime and basically nothing else. You know, if we run through this here, sentence 1 tells us that this guy is surveying a mansion, then the following sentences just literally repeat this same information in different ways. And this repetition makes us feel like we're treading water and not making any forward momentum with the story. I can't emphasize this point enough. On your opening page, you should be looking critically at every single sentence and asking yourself, is this progressing the plot or the characters or the world building? Is it telling me new information with each successive sentence? And if there is none of that progression, then your reader is probably going to switch off and not get connected and hooked into your story. So you might be wondering right now, Jed, how do I actually fix a slow rate of revelation? Well, let's take that example that I just showed you with the Luca character and give it a faster rate of revelation and see what impact it actually has on the story. Luca narrowed his eyes as he watched the mansion from atop a nearby roof. Golden light spilled from an open window on the 3rd floor. One of the partying guests must have left it open. Perfect. That was his way in. He checked his belt, making sure his dagger and poison flask was in reach. Then he flicked a grapple across the street. The padded hook latched onto a gargoyle on the mansion's roof. Luca slithered over, then descended towards the open window, feeling grim determination fill his body. He had waited too long for this. Now we've only added an extra 7 words in total here, but can you see how much faster this feels? That's because each sentence builds new understanding and curiosity within your reader, giving them more opportunity to be hooked into your story. For example, rather than the second sentence just telling us it's night, it also tells us that there's an open window, which immediately makes you consider, why is Luca paying attention to this detail? Is he planning to sneak in, perhaps? And then in sentence 3, we reveal that there is a party going on. This is new information. It changes the context we have and develops our understanding of this scene. Then sentence 4 is just one word, perfect, which makes you wonder, why is this so good for Luca? Sentence 5 confirms that he is in fact going to sneak in. Then sentence 6 tells us he has a dagger and poison, so he's probably an assassin, and so forth. When readers say that a scene is badly paced, it usually means that they don't feel like information is being dripped out to them fast enough. And as a result, they're not forced to pay attention and they can just switch their brains off and mentally check out of your story. Of course, you can go the opposite way and have a rate of revelation that feels too fast. And part of the skill of being a writer is knowing how to alter your rate of revelation at different points in the story. As you get deeper into your fantasy novel, you probably do want to have some moments where you slow down the rate of revelation and you allow the reader to linger and to enjoy a scene without feeling like they're having to rush through things. But especially on your first page, I highly suggest that you have a higher rate of revelation because most new fantasy writers, when I'm reading their stories, it's not fast enough and they're just kind of treading water and not really moving the story forward. There's a bonus tip here that will take this even further. Try to merge and compress your ideas as much as possible. Having a sentence that reveals new character information is good, but if you can also reveal something about your world building with that same sentence, then your rate of revelation gets increased even more. And this gives you yet another opportunity to hook your reader. Now, you can have a fantastic rate of revelation in your opening page, but it's going to be meaningless if you make the next mistake, which I'll get to in a minute. But first, the absolute quickest way that I know of to improve your opening pages in your fantasy novel is to get feedback from an experienced editor. And that is why I am really excited to announce that I'm running a live first chapter critique workshop. This workshop is going to run on June the 30th. It's specifically for fantasy writers. And when you sign up to this workshop, you'll be able to send in your chapter to me. And I will be reading all the submitted chapters and then picking 3 writers to critique live in the workshop. This is going to be an absolute masterclass in how to write great first chapters. And you'll be able to see all of the principles I'm talking about in this video put directly into action as I go through and critique your work. Here's what one of my previous clients said about my editing.
This was an incredible experience. I think from the very first time I got a critique from Jed, like my brain was on fire with just like how much there was to think about and how much there was to improve in my story. And it just filled me with passion to keep going and keep writing and keep improving. And, you know, I just could not recommend the experience more. Jed is a phenomenal teacher. He's a phenomenal writer.
You can get your workshop ticket by clicking the link in the description down below. Spots are limited for this, so if you are interested, I do encourage you to sign up quickly. And if you are watching this video after the workshop has run, then you will have the option to get a recording of the workshop instead. So I hope to see you there on the workshop. And now let's move on to mistake number 3 that I often see in the opening pages of fantasy novels, which is no taste of your unique storytelling proposition. There are thousands of fantasy books out there. What is going to make someone want to read your book? The answer to that question is your unique storytelling proposition, or your USP. Your USP is created through the unique intersection of your life experiences, voice and style, thematic interests, favored story tropes, and many more elements. This creates something that feels really fresh and exciting through the combination of all these different variables. So think of it like this. If you had a pack of 52 playing cards and you shuffled them into a random combination, the number of possible combinations you could shuffle these playing cards into is actually more than the number of atoms on Earth. And I find that tremendously inspiring because it means that by combining all these different variables I just mentioned, you are able to produce something that feels truly unique and fresh in your writing. Now, of course, when you start out as a writer, you're probably going to sound very similar to the main authors that have influenced you. But the more you write and read and learn and live your life and merge all these different experiences together into your unique creative expression, the more fresh and original and distinctive your voice will become as an author. And the stronger you'll become at developing and enhancing the USP for each book you write. And the better you get at refining your USP, the better you become at offering stories that readers cannot get anywhere else in the world, which will make them flock to you and you'll develop magnetic fans. To make this a little bit more practical, here's a few example USPs from some of my favorite authors. So with Brandon Sanderson, we have distinctive, original, deep world building with unique hard magic systems. With Joe Abercrombie, we've got realistic, complex characters who exist in a morally grey and gritty world with lashings of dark comedy. With Patrick Rothfuss, we've got gorgeous, immersive prose that somehow makes a musical performance more exciting than a fight with a dragon. Of course, it's impossible for you to be 100% fully unique in your USP, and those authors I've just mentioned, they don't even have a full monopoly on those attributes I just described. So don't despair if you feel like you can never reach that standard of full originality, because I don't really think full originality even exists anyway. What is important is that you are aware of the USP you're aiming for with your fantasy novel, and that on page 1 of your story, you give readers a very clear taste of what that USP is. The reason why this is so important is that your opening page is training readers in how to read the rest of your novel. So if your story is mostly dialogue driven with a humorous, upbeat tone to it, starting your first page off with a long description of this dystopian wasteland that feels very grim and dire might not be setting the right expectations and promises for your narrative. This is why personally, I'll sometimes go back and rewrite my first chapter or write an entirely new first chapter after I've completed the first draft for my book. Obviously, I'll have a first chapter that I've written in that first draft, but sometimes with a couple of the novels I've written, I do feel the need to then go back and construct a new entry point in that story so that I can achieve better synthesis with the rest of the narrative as a whole. Now let's look at a brilliant example of introducing a USP from The Lies of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch. This book follows a charming yet mischievous con artist set in this Venetian-inspired fantasy city as he pulls off various crimes and heists with his thieving crew. There's a lot of great dark comedy in this book, and the whole series has a very capricious, whimsical tone at the same time. So, how does Lynch set up this USP in the opening few sentences of his novel? At the height of the long wet summer of the 77th year of Sendovani, the thief maker of Camor paid a sudden and unannounced visit to the eyeless priests at the temple of Perilandro, desperately hoping to sell the Lamora boy. "Have I got a deal for you?" the thief maker began, perhaps inauspiciously. "Another deal like Calo and Galdo, maybe?" said the eyeless priest. "I've still got my hands full training those giggling idiots out of every bad habit they picked up from you, and replacing them with the bad habits I need. Now, Chains," the thief maker shrugged, I told you they were shit-flinging little monkeys when we made the deal. So I love that opening. Let's break down what Lynch is actually doing here. In this short passage, we've got some great world building. We've got names like Sendovani, Carlo, Gaudo, giving us this very clear Italian-inspired feeling to the setting. We've got conmen. The thief maker is almost trying to pull off a mini heist of sorts by getting rid of the Lamora boy, who is clearly causing him some trouble. And also, he's like literally called Thief Maker. How much more on the nose do you want to get? But it works. And then likewise, the eyeless priest is also referred to as Chains, which makes you start to wonder if the eyeless priest name is a bit of a, cover name or a secret identity for him. Then we have character. We get the sense that there's something special about Lamora. Why is he causing so much of a problem for the thief maker? Then we have the voice and tone. There's such a fun sense of banter and humor here. We also get a swear word as well, which kind of establishes the mood and the audience for this story. And then in terms of dialogue, this is a novel with great banter between Locke and the members of his thieving crew, so Lynch just throws us right into dialogue from the get-go to show you how good he is at this element of story. Now, depending on your specific USP in your fantasy novel, this is going to affect the type of entry point you want to choose into your book, which is why it's so important to avoid the next mistake, not understanding the various opening options you have available. There is no one right way to start your fantasy novel, and thinking that there is a huge mistake. That's why it is so important to be aware of all the various opening options that are available to you as an author. As I was studying dozens of fantasy novels in preparation for this video, I realized that there were 6 common opening options that kept coming up again and again. Now, this is not an exhaustive list, but once you are aware of all of these 6 elements, you'll be much better equipped to choose the right one for your particular book. And the first opening element is directly into dialogue. So this is where you start by putting us right into a dialogue exchange between 2 or more characters. Dialogue can be such a great way to create instant momentum and excitement from the very beginning of your story. Typically, dialogue gives you a very high rate of revelation, and there's a lot of opportunity for character development because you are forcing them to clash heads and to interact with each other, just like in the Lies of Locke Lamora example I gave a minute ago. The second opening option you have is the strange world building open. So in the modern era, there is this common idea and common writing advice, I suppose, that you should not begin your story with world building and that you shouldn't info dump a bunch of stuff about your world on page 1. Respectfully, I think that is horrible advice because there are plenty of great exceptions to this rule. The thing to remember is that an info dump will not feel bad if you do it well. If you have interesting details about your world and you convey them to us in a fascinating manner, readers will not care if you begin your story with an explanation of how your world works. As long as you can make that world building interesting and unique enough, then that could be a fantastic vessel into your story, especially if you're writing a book where the USP revolves around the intricate and original and fresh world building that you're exploring. So with this strange world building format, that is basically what you do. You give us an interesting, unique world building detail that hooks us and makes us want to learn more about this world, this setting, and the people that live within it. It is important to mention, it doesn't have to be all of your world building in one go, and generally speaking, the stories that do this best, they just give you one vivid, arresting detail from the world that makes you then lean in and want to get more of that as you go through the story. Ideally, this world building detail gives you a sense of the story's tone and the characters, and maybe even a suggestion of what the plot might be. For example, The Color of Magic, which is the first Discworld book by Terry Pratchett, opens by describing how this flat fantasy world rests on the back of 4 giant elephants, which themselves stand on a giant turtle that is flying through space. Apart from the turtle and the elephants, we don't actually meet any of the main characters from this story. There's not even really a suggestion of the story's plot. We just get this hilarious world-building detail that brilliantly sets up the farcical Monty Python-esque comedy of Terry Pratchett's Discworld. Take, for example, this brilliant passage from the opening. There was, for example, the theory that Atuan, that's the turtle, had come from nowhere and would continue at a uniform crawl or steady gait into nowhere for all time. This theory was popular among academics. An alternative, favored by those of a religious persuasion, was that Atuan was crawling from the birthplace to the time of mating, as were all the stars in the sky, which were obviously also carried by giant turtles. When they arrived, they would briefly and passionately mate for the first and only time, and from that fiery union, new turtles would be born to carry a new pattern of worlds. This was known as the Big Bang hypothesis. Opening option number 3 is what I call the dead body. So if you're reading a mystery novel, it's very common for these stories to begin with a character getting killed. Then we shift to the detective who will have to uncover and solve the mystery around this murder. This particular format of introducing a mystery in isolation and then meeting your main character after the fact can be really effective in fantasy novels as well. And many prologues that you've probably read will follow this structure. Again, it doesn't have to literally be a dead body, that's just an easy way of remembering it. For example, the opening of a Game of Thrones opens with a group of scouts finding a bunch of horribly mutilated corpses beyond the frozen wall in the north of Westeros. The scouts themselves are then ambushed by these same mysterious supernatural creatures that did the killings, and that is our prologue for the story. Then in chapter 1, we meet the Stark family and we are properly introduced to the central cast of the story as a whole. But what that prologue does really well is it creates suspense about the creatures beyond the wall, and it also establishes a clear promise to the reader that this is not just a story set place in a standard medieval setting, but there are also some elements of magic and the supernatural in the background as well. Opening option number 4. You're probably wondering how I got here. So this is a type of in media res or in the middle of things opening where you begin with a very dramatic moment that is close to the climax of your story, and then you rewind and explain how the character got to this point. One of the best examples of this comes from the opening of Empire of Silence, which is the first book in the Sun Eater series. I am loving this series at the moment. I'm 2 books in and I think it is absolutely fantastic. Take a look at how this story opens. Light. The light of that murdered sun still burns me. I see it through my eyelids, blazing out of history, from that bloody day, hinting at fires indescribable. It is like something holy, as if it were the light of God's own heaven that burned the world and billions of lives with it. I carry that light always, seared into the back of my mind. I make no excuses, no denials, no apologies for what I have done. I know what I am. So this introduces Hadrian Marlowe, who is this person who goes on to destroy a sun and essentially commit genocide against an entire alien race. The story then rewinds to his childhood, which is set long before that event, and explains how he reached that point. But through doing this, it creates a massive curiosity gap. How did this person reach this point where he decided to commit such a heinous act? And the great advantage of this particular opening option is that if you get your hook strong enough, it's going to propel readers to get through even if they encounter sluggish moments within your story. As I was reading Empire of Silence, there were moments in this book that did feel a bit slow for me, but knowing that there was this like crazy hook at the beginning and knowing that my character was going to reach this, insane climax of blowing up a sun, it motivated me to get through some of those slower portions. Opening option number 5 is the story in miniature technique. So with this opening option, you basically tell a contained, almost short story version of your wider book. So with this opening option, you are essentially telling a almost short story, self-contained version of your entire novel. This might connect directly with your plot or set up the events of your plot, or it might just be something that kind of functions as its own isolated little mood builder to establish the tone and maybe introduce some of the key characters and rules and thematic interests of your book. If you can actually do this at the level of your opening sentence or your opening sentences, that's even better. Take, for example, how Stephen King begins The Dark Tower. The man in black fled across the desert, and the gunslinger followed. In this one sentence, we meet the protagonist and the antagonist, and we immediately establish what they are going to be doing over the course of this book and the series. The gunslinger is going to be following the man in black. And it also tells you a little bit about the setting in the desert as well. It's so simple and it's brilliant. In my own writing, I tried to use the story in miniature technique with the beginning of Across the Broken Stars, my space fantasy novel. Here's how I opened that story. Leon hated Varian airships, but since unloading them put beers on his table, he faked a smile as he picked up the crate. "Good evening, Captain," he said. "I hope you fall in the sea and drown," he thought. So what I tried to do here is to immediately establish racial tension between the Varian colonizers and the native Payan population, which Leon is a member of. I also wanted to show that Leon is living a compromised life where he's not feeling particularly fulfilled and he doesn't feel brave enough to express the true thoughts inside him. I also wanted to establish that Leon is a bit of an alcoholic and he kind of is a bit down in the dumps with his life, setting up the character arc and the progression that he will go through over the course of this story. And then lastly, I think mentioning things like captains and airships suggests a certain aspect of adventure and travel and questing which takes place later in the book. And then a few hundred words after this particular opening, Leon meets a nervous Payan girl who wants Leon's help to reach this mythical safe haven that may or may not exist. Initially, he refuses her, but it does kick off the story where Leon and this girl are basically going to be trying to find this place hunted by Varians along the way. So you can see in this sense that those opening few sentences I established here are really setting up what this story is about thematically as a whole. And then the sixth opening option I've listed here is what I call the Hype Man opening. So with this type of opening, you begin in a side character's perspective. Then you use this side character to build up our understanding of a main point of view character. Once you've done that, you then slip into that main point of view character's perspective, but the reader has already been primed with a certain expectation or first impression of who this person is. And as a result, when we get into their perspective, it usually feels more impactful because you've already built them up from the outside. For example, the opening of Jade City by Fonda Lee begins with two would-be jade thieves attempting to steal some magical jade from a restaurant. While they are pretending to be waiters, they notice Mike Ken and Mike Ta, who are two high-ranking officers in the No Peak clan. The presence of the two Mike brothers concerns them. Mike Ken and Mike Ta, now they were real greenbones. Sinewy men, their fingers heavy with jade rings, fighting talon knives with jade inlaid hilts strapped to their waists. They were dressed well, dark collared shirts and tailored tan jackets, shiny black shoes, billed hats. The Mikes were well-known members of the No Peak clan, which controlled most of the neighborhoods on this side of the city. So basically, what Fonda Lee is doing here is establishing the two thieves as little fish. The Mike brothers, they are slightly bigger fish. But then we see how the Mike brothers are talking with Cole Hilo, who is the second most powerful person in the No Peak clan. So he himself is an even bigger fish. And then when we eventually get into Hilo's perspective later on in the story, because he is one of the three main point of view characters, he feels important and it feels meaningful and weighty to now be in his point of view. Now, the fifth mistake that I often see new fantasy writers make on their opening page is overwhelming your reader with details. We really don't need to understand everything about your story on the opening page of your novel. And I know that there's so many aspects of your story that you probably want to communicate to your readers, but it is really important to exercise a degree of restraint on your first page. And that also can apply to your first few chapters as well. Introducing dozens of characters and a metric ton of lore to dump on your readers' heads in your first couple of pages is a recipe for making them confused and probably not that engaged in your story as a whole. That's not to say that you can't do it, but the degree of difficulty increases with every successive character that you're jamming into these opening pages. Even with something like The Fellowship of the Ring, the first Lord of the Rings book, you would probably agree with me in saying that this is a story with a lot of characters, a lot of lore, a lot of world building, but the story doesn't necessarily begin by smashing all of that into you. Instead, we begin by understanding the lives of the hobbits in the Shire, their practices, their relationships, their perspectives on the world, and it's only once we kind of get out of the Shire that the story begins to expand from there. I find that this structure works really well for most new fantasy writers that I work with. Most of the time, you are better off starting small and focused. Introduce one or two or maybe a few more core characters in your story, give readers a few interesting aspects of your world, dangle an irresistible narrative hook in front of them, and then once that connection is made, you can take things deeper from there. So look at your first pages and really critically ask yourself, does all this information need to be here? Do all these characters need to be present in this moment? And can I condense and trim this down so that readers have an easier time of getting into my story? And this brings me to mistake number 6, which is thinking that you need to do all of this perfectly in one go. After everything you and I have just talked about, you might be now feeling a tremendous amount of pressure to be writing this really great first chapter that avoids all these mistakes I've mentioned. With so many of my books, the first chapter that I wrote was radically different to the one that was later published and read by my audience. For some of my projects, I've even gone back and written an entirely new first chapter just to set up my story in a better way. Because sometimes you just need that full understanding of what your story is before you know how to perfectly introduce it. And a really good example of this comes from Kingdom of Dragons, and this is actually our test edition. So Kingdom of Dragons funded on Kickstarter last year, and we're in the process right now of printing it and sending out this beautiful Kickstarter edition to all the backers. You can see, because this is a test edition, there's actually no contents inside the book. I promise the final thing does have words in it, but I really love how it's got this kind of nice gold foil on it. And you can see the hardback edition on my shelf back over here. I think it looks really nice, and it's so much more weighty and substantial than some of my other books like Across the Broken Stars here. So it's really great to hold it in my hand. But I bring up this story because when I initially wrote this, I began my story with part one, sort of featuring my main characters, Rovan and Zora, going through a particularly influential event in their childhood. This is Zora here, and this is Rovan over here. And this first section of the story was really important for kind of giving them their motivations for the rest of the narrative. But my beta readers told me that it felt a little bit too slow. And so I literally cut out 11,000 words from the start of this book and began with part two instead, which is where we meet Rovan and Zora, who are now adult characters. In the case of Zora, we see her on a mission to free a town from bandits. She is a ranger's apprentice at this stage of the story. And in the case of Rovan, we see him going through this very difficult trial in order to become a Sun Warden's apprentice. And now the cool thing was that because I had actually written those 11,000 words that did get cut, some of those cutscenes were then fed into the story as flashbacks. Some of them were details that were just briefly mentioned. And some of it was just for me to get an understanding of what my characters were about and what my story was about as a whole. And as a result of cutting that, the story now has a much better sense of flow and progression at the start, and we kind of go immediately into the conflict in a much more engaging way. And the key point from all of that I want you to take away from this is that writing is really the process of layering and editing, and then some more editing on top of that. Don't overthink your first chapter in your first draft. Just get it down, go ahead, write the rest of your first draft, and then once you've figured out what your story is really about, then you can always come back, implement the tips from this video, and build a better first chapter for your story. And if you want to see me analyze a first chapter from one of my favorite fantasy novels with the author of that novel sitting next to me and sharing his direct thoughts and techniques with me on the call, then you might want to check out this video over here where I sat down with Joe Abercrombie to analyze the opening from A Little Hatred.